Okay, I'm going to start with a graph that I like to show my first year students to help put things in perspective. It shows estimated global GDP over time from the year 1 AD to today. And this version is from Our World in Data, but you can find many others all with pretty much the same shape. So, with the risk of patronizing members of the audience, try and think what happened around 1800. That's right, it's the Industrial Revolution, which, as you all know, and which the graph reminds us, completely transformed living standards, first for Britons and other Europeans, and later for the great majority of the global population. If we had to point to the single most important event in human economic history, it would be the Industrial Revolution. Indeed, looking at this graph, it might seem as if there were no other events in global economic history of any consequence. As an ancient historian, though, I do want to draw your attention to another revolution that took place around 10,000 years before the beginning of that last graph, that is, about 10,000 years BC. And perhaps it'll be a slightly less easy question if I ask you to tell me what that revolution was. Yes, this is the Neolithic Revolution, the moment at which agriculture began to spread out from its first discovery in the hilly flanks in the Fertile Crescent, pushing hunter-gatherers to the margins and putting settled villages and societies in their place. Even if our previous graph had gone back to 10,000 BC, the Neolithic Revolution would probably not even have shown up, dwarfed by the momentous upward surge of the Industrial Revolution. On a logarithmic chart, though, like this one, we can see its true significance, increasing human population by an order of magnitude or more. And the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that this one graphs estimated population rather than GDP, but these are usually thought to have grown roughly in tandem over the long term. So perhaps we should say that besides these two transformational episodes, the Neolithic Revolution around 12,000 years ago and the Industrial Revolution around 200 years ago, there were no other economic events of any consequence. Well, that, of course, would depend on what we mean by of any consequence. And while it's true that the Neolithic and Industrial Revolutions were particularly explosive, the past few decades of work in economic history have shown that there were also a few societies that experienced periods of consistent low-level growth. In fact, some of them went some way towards achieving not only extensive growth, larger populations with declining or stagnating living standards, but even some measure of intensive growth, so larger populations with higher average productivity and living standards as well. Jack Goldstone called periods in economic history like this efflorescences, and he noted that they tended to coincide with outstanding achievements in the cultural, political, and military spheres. Some of his examples were Holland and Britain in the run-up to the Industrial Revolution, Qing China, and Northwestern Europe during the High Middle Ages. And I now want to convince you that we should add another example to our list, the ancient Greek world, which was, of course, later subsumed into the Roman Empire. First, though, it's important to lower our expectations about growth somewhat. We live in a world of growth rates that were completely unprecedented before the Industrial Revolution. To take one of the most dramatic examples, China's average annual GDP growth between 1989 was some 9%. Since the 1950s, till a couple of years ago, Britain has grown by an average of about 2.3% every year, much lower than China's recent explosive growth, obviously, but still quite impressive by historical standards. In fact, both these rates of growth look very high from the standards of pre-modernity. Even in the 19th century, Britain, then the world's leading economic power, of course, was growing by something like 1.2% per year. That's one estimate for the period 1820 to 1920. In the 18th century, as Britain headed up the foothills of the Industrial Revolution and then began the steep, quick climb to modernity, the country was growing at no more than something like 0.2, 0.3%, a rate similar to Britain's only real economic rival in the 17th and 18th centuries, Holland, whose annual average growth has been estimated at 0.2% between 1850 and 1820. So with all that in mind, I hope it doesn't seem too disappointing when I announce that Ian Morris, in an article called Economic Growth in Ancient Greece, has estimated an annual rate of growth in the ancient Greek world between 800 and 300 BC of about 0.1%. In fact, not only should that not seem too disappointing, but it should actually be seen as downright impressive, especially since this rate was kept up for some 5 centuries. And something like it was even kept up in Roman times, at least to around 200 AD. The result of this low-level yet sustained growth was to transform the Greek world from a string of miserable villages and pirate outposts in the 10th and 9th centuries BC to the rich, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan civilization that would turn into the cultural engine room of the Roman Empire. And if you think I'm exaggerating about the lowly beginnings of Greek civilization, let me take you to Koukounaries, a hill village on the island of Paros. Although there are some signs of wealth in the village into the late Bronze Age, by the 11th century the villagers are bringing their animals behind the village walls and even into their houses. They're also stockpiling stones, in both cases almost certainly out of fear of seaborne raiders. Dark Age Greece, in other words, constitutes something of a low point in ancient Greek economic development. That's clear whether we look at population in the top graph, the average age of death, bottom left graph, or the size of houses in the bottom right. As the graph of age of death, bottom left, shows, though, this wasn't just a low starting point. It was itself a valley, the nadir of a decline that had set in around 1200 BC. And this gives Greek history what I like to call a hockey stick shape, a real hockey stick, obviously, with a short, sharp decline from the modest heights achieved during the Bronze Age, followed by a long, slow improvement or rise through the archaic, classical, and Hellenistic periods. In other words, what we usually mean when we talk about ancient Greece, as opposed to the prehistoric civilizations which preceded it on the island of Crete and in mainland Greece, that is the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. So where did these civilizations come from, and how did they come to achieve the relative prosperity that we see at the beginning of these graphs? For that, we'll need to back up again, right back to the first great transformation of human economic fortunes in the Neolithic Revolution. After agriculture is first practiced in the hilly flanks and the Fertile Crescent, it quickly begins to spread outwards, reaching Greece by about 7000 BC. Around the 3rd millennium BC, we have the development of the first empires in Egypt from around 3100, and Mesopotamia with the growth of the Akkadian Empire in the 24th century BC. From this point on, the broader Near East sees a rise of a whole family of large-ish agrarian empires. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, and others such as the that's the Hittites again, the Mitanni and Elam. So by the 14th century BC, the great kings of these states are writing letters to one another, one of which is pictured on the slide. They see each other as a band of brothers, leaders of rival states perhaps, but also members of a single civilization. In one of these letters, the Hittite king refers to the kings who are equal to me in rank as the king of Egypt, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, and the king of Ahiwan. Though he then scratches out this last one, having apparently decided that the king of Ahiwan, the king of the Ahiwans, he's decided that he wasn't quite at his level, so he scratches his name out. So where was Ahiwan? Well, after more than a century of scholarly controversy, we can now be virtually certain that the Ahiwans are the Mycenaean Greeks, whose culture flourishes roughly from the 18th century BC on. The Mycenaeans were preceded by the Minoans, who built up a distinctive culture on Crete and some nearby islands from the late 4th millennium on. It's these civilizations that took living standards up to the level that they were at the beginning of our hockey stick, especially at their apogee in the first couple of centuries of the 2nd millennium. And it seems clear that their prosperity was achieved by being a part, even if a somewhat marginal part, of the great civilizations of the Near East. Their architecture was similar, with the famous Lion's Gate at Mycenae echoing a similar gateway in the Hittite capital. Their art was similar. This fresco showing the characteristically Minoan pastime of bull leaping was actually found in Crete, not in Crete, but in Egypt, suggesting that artistic styles, if not exotic sports, could move around this large Near Eastern world. And most interestingly for our purposes, their economic systems were broadly similar, centered as they were around enormous so-called palaces that allowed for a huge number of different goods to be stored and inventoried. Now, it's easy to see why Arthur Evans, when he uncovered the great Cretan palace of Knossos, connected it with the old stories about King Minos and the enormous labyrinth he constructed to keep his stepson under wraps. His stepson, who happened, of course, to be half man, half bull. The truth, as usual, is probably more prosaic. Rather than a minotaur concealing labyrinth, what these palace complexes probably did was act as central nodes in an early sort of command economy. Goods of various sorts were brought in from the countryside and then inventoried by a scribal class. One of the Linear B tablets from Mycenae lists 20 woolen cloaks which are to be well boiled. Later, these were perhaps redistributed in a process that was overseen by the palace elite. Whatever exactly went on in the great palace complexes of the Bronze Age, by about 1100, they were no more. What happened? Only one of the greatest civilizational collapses in human history. We don't have a completely satisfying account of what caused the Bronze Age collapse, as it's known, but it's clear that palace complexes across the Near Eastern world went up in flame as the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age world were besieged by what the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III describes on his funerary monument as the Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? Again, it's unclear, though they were perhaps some combination of Mycenaean Greeks and raiders from the Western Mediterranean, especially the islands of Sardinia and Sicily. What was driving them, and how did their invasions manage to precipitate a collapse of this entire civilization? Again, it's unclear, though changes in military technology, natural disasters, and, very topically, plague may have played some role. So with the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations to the east, Greece was plunged into a dark age. Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations were lost forever, and so were their palace elites, their scribes and writing systems, and their redistributive economic systems. When the Greek world did eventually start to recover during what's known as the 8th century Renaissance, it would have to chart its own path, no longer simply as an extension of a larger Near Eastern civilization, but as a civilization in its own right. Cut off from the tin of Anatolia, the Greeks turned to iron, whose ore was relatively common, something that made it less easily monopolized by an elite than bronze had been. With the linear A and B writing systems forgotten, the Greeks developed a new way of writing based on the Phoenician alphabet and including vowels, which made it easier to use and pick up. And they developed a new form of social organization, small scale and relatively egalitarian, in which civic and religious authority tended to be separate. The city-state, or polis, which was soon being exported across the Mediterranean world. Since we're now at the beginning of the Greeks' slow but steady economic rise, let's look back at the three graphs I showed you before, but this time one at a time. This will also allow us to answer a question that a few of you may have had at the back of your minds during our brief detour through the Bronze Age. That is, how do we know that the Greek economy was growing during this period at all? Well, we can start first with population, which has been intensively studied, most recently and effectively by combining intensive survey archaeology with demographic history. Again, I'll give you Ian Morris's graph, which shows population increasing some tenfold between 800 and 300 BC at a rate of over 0.4% per year on average. For a pre-modern population, this is quite fast and was probably about 4 times the rate of population growth in the Mediterranean as a whole during the same period. It's a point we'll come back to. For the moment, note how a small but steady rate of growth leads to significant change over the long term. In the Dark Age, the biggest centers of population in the Greek world, Argos, for example, had only a couple thousand inhabitants. By the Classical period, we have great cities like Athens and Syracuse, with citizen population of some 50,000, and perhaps 300 or 400 inhabitants in total. That was partly a product of urbanization, but this more urbanized world was also a more populous one. And it wasn't just a more populous and more urbanized world, it also seems to have been one with higher living standards. So if that's true, then what we have is evidence not only for aggregate growth because of a growing population, but also per capita growth, with the average member of the population being better off. And this is something that's very difficult to pull off in a pre-modern economy, but it looks like the ancient Greeks may well have achieved it, even if they did so at the very modest level, the very modest rates of growth that I hope I've convinced you to expect from the pre-modern world. The first technique that's provided evidence for improving living standards is skeletal analysis. On the slide, you can see the average age of death for adult skeletons at various periods in ancient Greek history. The firm lines are from analyses carried out by John Lawrence Angell in the 1970s, and the dotted lines combine several studies conducted using updated methods in the 1990s. Now, I should emphasize that this is the average age of death of adult skeletons. In other words, all these analyses exclude child skeletons, which are unfortunately quite plentiful in the classical period especially. So this isn't life expectancy at birth, but it does give a fair idea of how long people in ancient Greek could expect to live if they were among the lucky 60% who made it out of infancy. As you can see, things are quite grim by our standards, with the average Greek dying well before their 50th birthday, even in late classical times. But you can also see what I call the hockey stick shape of ancient Greek economic history, with Bronze Age Greeks living relatively long lives, Dark Age Greeks dying relatively young, and Archaic and Classical Greece seeing a slow but steady increase in longevity. And that slow but steady increase in longevity was enough, it seems, to raise the average adult age at death from below 30 for both men and women, according to the revised figures, to 35 or more. In both cases, the difference approaches a whole extra decade of life. Of course, that women were living 9 or 10 years longer does a lot to explain the rise of population that we saw in the last graph, with longer lives for women also increasing the period in which they could be having babies, or what demographers call the potentially fecund period. We can get a different view of living standards by looking at house sizes, which are displayed on this graph. Since what archaeologists uncover are almost always floor plans rather than full houses, we can't always be sure whether Greek houses had 2 stories or not. Accordingly, the bottom line of the graph shows the growth just in the size of floor plans, while the higher line shows estimated roofed area, if we make some reasonable assumptions about the number of second floors on houses in different periods. Now, this graph doesn't go back beyond the 8th century Renaissance, though if it did, I suspect it would again show our hockey stick shape, at least in the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri on Santorini, which was frozen in time by a volcanic eruption sometime around 1600 BC, we do find quite good sized houses with upper floors, like the one pictured top right in black and white. But more importantly for our purposes, is the graph again shows a significant upward trend, especially in the classical period, that is after 500 BC. Across the entire period, we again have quite a dramatic transformation, with a typical Greek house increasing in size by some 350%, from 80 square meters to 250 square meters. And archaeological and textual evidence can help us fill this picture in. Greek Dark Age houses, like the one at top left, tended to feature a thatched roof over a single room with a beaten earth floor. By the late classical period, a good Athenian house, as reconstructed bottom right, would feature 5 or 6 rooms around a courtyard, a paved floor, and tile roofs. Now, Ian Morris's precise estimate of around 0.1% growth in ancient Greece, or strictly 0.07 to 0.14% in per capita consumption, 0.6 to 0.9% in aggregate consumption, that estimate for between 800 and 300 BC, these haven't been accepted by everybody. But as Morris himself stressed, the question is how wrong it could be, given the evidence for a significant, if not dramatic, increase in ancient Greek consumption and living standards from the Dark Ages to the Hellenistic period. And what I presented so far in this lecture, I should note, is really just what I consider the most striking and important categories of evidence. Josh Ober, in his survey of the evidence, includes a few more indicators that I won't be able to go into in any detail today. By Ober's calculations, the number of hoards of coins found by archaeologists quadruples from the 5th to the 4th centuries BC, and the average number of coins in these hoards quadruples from the 6th to the 4th century. Again, an increase in the amount of circulating precious metal coins or even non-circulating isn't decisive evidence for a change in GDP, but it's another indicator that supports our picture of economic expansion in ancient Greece. Now, what I've done so far is to lay out some of the evidence for economic growth in the ancient Greek world across the central stretch of the first millennium BC. What I haven't done is say anything to evaluate this or to say how we might feel about it. I myself tend to think that increases in population, longevity, house sizes, and so on are generally good things, but even those who agree with this may have some reasonable concerns at this point. One question that might be asked, and I'm sure it's one that's familiar to the audience, is you've shown that there was likely slow but significant growth in aggregate and even average living standards in this period, but couldn't this have been consistent with rising inequality and even with stagnating living standards for the worst off? The answer to that is, of course, yes, that's possible. The ancient Greek economic development could have been a hellish or simply very unpleasant descent into extreme inequality. And that it involved some increase in inequality seems almost inevitable. As Walter Scheidel, following Thomas Piketty, has argued, really substantial drops in inequality tend to be the product of catastrophes, wars, revolutions, plagues, or natural disasters, or some combination of these. Now, the Bronze Age collapse I mentioned above certainly constitutes a catastrophe of this type, and most Dark Age Greek towns were likely quite egalitarian because there was very little wealth to go around and everybody had equally little. It wasn't set in stone, though, that the new civilization that emerged from the Greek Dark Ages would be radically unequal. And in fact, the new culture that did emerge was strikingly egalitarian relative both to the prehistoric civilizations that had preceded it in Greece and Crete, and to the great agrarian empires of the Near East, both before and after 1200 BC. Though periods of one-man rule were hardly unheard of, Greek city-states tended to be governed by oligarchies or democracies, and there was something of a taboo on rulers claiming divinity, at least until the time of Alexander the Great. The city-states did have social elites. There was in fact quite a well-defined Greek aristocratic culture, but these elites were markedly less grand and flashy than their Persian or Roman counterparts. And there is evidence that this cultural egalitarianism went hand in hand with a modest form of economic egalitarianism. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate this. Slavery was a constant in the ancient world, and women had very limited autonomy, including economic autonomy. Within the male citizenry, though, inequality was successfully kept within certain bounds. Using the Athenian census of 322 BC, for example, Geoffrey Cron has estimated a Gini coefficient for the city of 0.7. Not as egalitarian as Canada in 1998, but a little more so than Florence in 1427, and much more so than Britain or the US in the early 20th century. And this seems to fit together with indications that relatively poor citizens of city-states like Athens were, while hardly well off by our standards, at least as well off as poor people in some of the most developed pre-modern economies. Walter Scheidel, for example, has tried to calculate a wheat wage for a number of ancient societies. Now, the wheat wage is the amount of wheat a laborer could buy per day and has become a useful way of comparing wages against different societies and currencies. As you can see, the amount of wheat available to an unskilled laborer in classical Athens was strikingly high. Indeed, by Scheidel's reckoning, it amounts to between 2 and 5 times the amount needed for bare survival. In fact, if Scheidel's estimates are correct, classical Athenian laborers enjoyed real wages that are comparable to those in Golden Age Holland, one of the most advanced pre-modern economies. So in view of the substantial equality enjoyed by the citizens of Greek city-states, we might be tempted to see ancient Greece as a kind of proto-Keynesian or even redistributionist wonderland in which state institutions helped lessen the differences between rich and poor. A former teacher of mine, John Ma, has even talked about a Stiglitzian polis. And city-states certainly had sophisticated ways of taxing the rich. Athens' regime of so-called liturgies, or compulsory donations and public service from the richest 1% of Athenians, is only one example. As aristocrats constantly complained, Athens' democratic and even military institutions tended to pay out public funds for participation in ways that made the poorest citizens better off. At the same time, we need to keep the involvement of ancient states in the economy in perspective. Even in Athens, which spent relatively large amounts on its political institutions and public festivals, state expenditure was never more than about 25% of GDP, and the largest portion of that went to the military. In view of this, it may be that though the institutions of the city-state helped spread the proceeds of growth reasonably evenly, it isn't so much within the polis that we need to look for the real drivers of ancient Greek growth, but without or outside of it. The ancient Greek world was, perhaps above all, a world of cities and of city-states, over 1,000 by classical times, from southern France and Italy to Egypt and the shores of the Black Sea. Some 30% of Greeks lived in towns with more than 5,000 inhabitants, compared to only around 10% at the high point of the Roman Empire's economic development. Compared to rivals like Rome, then, two things seem to characterize the ancient Greek world: that it was unusually urban and that it was unusually decentralized. Although Greek city-states did occasionally form leagues and even smallish empires, the entire Greek world was never absorbed into a single enduring state comparable to the Persian or the Roman empires. It could thus reap the kinds of advantages that were available to early modern Europe's constellation of states: interstate trade, a relatively open market for new ideas and technologies, and perhaps above all, competition. So if the Greek world's fragmentation and decentralization, if it was that was a key factor in the economic growth I've outlined today, that would make a certain amount of sense. After all, what we need to explain the Greek economic miracle is something that was unique to ancient Greece, or at least unusual. Ian Morris, in seeking to explain the economic advances he's done so much to shed light on, has appealed to Greece's location at a crossroads between the Near East and Europe. But this won't do, as Greece's location has remained constant through time, while levels of development have varied widely through the various periods of ancient and modern Greek history. As this chart, again compiled by Ober, shows, aggregate consumption in mainland Greece didn't surpass classical levels until well into the 20th century. The conclusion seems inescapable. There was something special, not about Greece, but about the particular culture and institutions of classical Greece. And there was something special about ancient Greece, not only when we compare it to Byzantine or Ottoman Greece, but when we compare it to its rivals in the ancient world. As we've seen, population growth in Greece was some 4 times the rate in the larger Mediterranean at the time. And if Ober's suggested rate of 1.5% per capita growth for Greece is correct, and note that that's higher than Morris's, that would mean that the ancient Greek world grew some 1.5 times the estimated rate of the Roman Empire from about the year 1 to 200 AD. And that would be very interesting indeed, since we usually think of the Roman Empire as the polity that drove social development in Western Eurasia to levels that wouldn't be seen again until the European Renaissance. The Romans always acknowledged the Greeks' preeminence in literature, the arts, and in science. And it may be that it was the eastern half of the empire, with its ancient cities and its trade networks, that was always the main driver of Roman economic growth. In this perspective, the Roman Empire's wealth, even in the 2nd century AD, the period that Edward Gibbon suggested was the most happy and prosperous in pre-modern history, that could have had as much to do with the continued thriving of the highly urbanized and fragmented Greek political economy as it did from gains from centralization. Well, that's a controversy for another time. For the time being, though, you're probably wondering, after I've gone through all the evidence for growth in ancient Greece, why I've given the lecture the title, Did the Greeks Have an Economy? Well, strange as it may sound, that the ancient Greeks had no markets and no economy in any modern sense was long the orthodoxy within classical studies. That was due to the work of this man, Sir Moses Finley, an American ancient historian who fled to England after being sacked for his communist sympathies during the McCarthy era. Finley later became the master of Darwin College, Cambridge, as well as a Knight of the Realm. And there's no doubt that he was one of the great ancient historians of his era. But the orthodoxy he established with regard to the ancient economy has now been pretty comprehensively dismantled. Finley saw ancient economic activity as embedded within culture and social structures. Ancient trade for Finley tended to resemble practices like gift giving rather than the kinds of transactions within a relatively free market that we've become used to. Because of this, economics didn't really exist as a separate sphere of activity or theory in the ancient world, and there was certainly no concept of economic agents rationally pursuing profits or utility. Finley's views had some support from the literary sources, whose aristocratic authors could be rather scornful of the world of getting and spending. And though there are works called Economics, Oikonomika, attributed to both Xenophon and Aristotle, these deal almost entirely with the management of the household, that is, of the oikos. On the other hand, there are discussions even in the literary sources that make clear that the Greeks could and did think about the kinds of thing we would now refer to as economics. Another work of Xenophon, his Resources, puts forward a number of proposals to boost Athenian state revenue, including attracting more immigrants, boosting the city's reputation as a fair place to engage in trade, and opening up the mining industry to non-citizens. And in recent decades, scholars like Alain Bresson have been able to show, through detailed studies of individual city-states, that the Greek world was one of considerable economic sophistication, with various mechanisms for levying taxes and rents, rudimentary banks, and a widespread capacity for forward planning of the sort that Xenophon was clearly engaged in. This more detailed picture of what was actually happening in ancient Greek city-state economies, as well as simply what elite theorists were or weren't saying about economic matters, may go some way towards filling out the picture of how precisely the ancient Greeks managed a rate of growth that was, as we've seen, both slow and, over the long term, quite transformative. As I've indicated, there are still a number of open questions that should keep ancient economic historians busy for decades to come, not least the question of whether the Greco-Roman efflorescence as a whole was more a product of the Roman Empire's centralization or of the decentralized Greek world that Rome absorbed. For the time being, though, I hope I have been able to provide a clear answer to the question of whether the Greeks had an economy. They did indeed, and it was a very successful one.